Hello, my name is Outi Honkatukia. I'm the Director for Climate and Chemicals in the Ministry of Environment of Finland, and I have the honor of doing the presentation today. So, starting with the NDC. Finland is part of the European Union's joint NDC. We have an economy-wide absolute emission reduction target of at least 55% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. The implementation period is from 2021 to 2030. It includes and covers all of the EU member states and all of the gases. The EU has very recently submitted its new NDC of a net greenhouse gas emission reduction by 66.25 to 72.5% by 2035 compared to the 1990 levels. Now, Finland has no individual or separate NDC under the Paris Agreement. The EU's NDC is implemented as part of the Fit for 55 package, which includes a package of policy measures covering climate, energy, transport, taxation, and so on. Now, going forward, we have the European climate law that sets the binding targets to reduce emissions by 2030 and also to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The EU's new NDC is an ambitious milestone on path to a net 90% net reduction by 2040 compared to the 1990 levels. The main EU's climate policy instruments include the emission trading system, which covers power and heat, industrial installations, aviation, and maritime. The effort sharing regulation, where member states have got country-specific emission reduction obligations. Finland's obligation is to reduce the emissions by 50% by 2030. It covers waste, small industry, agriculture, buildings and transport. And then there is the LULUCF sector and the regulation for the LULUCF. I do want to pause here for a moment and say a few words about Finland's Climate Act, which sets the targets for Finland to be climate neutral by 2035. It is very ambitious. It also sets emission reduction targets for 2030, 2040 and 2050. So minus 60% by 2030, minus 80% by 2040, and at least minus 90%, aiming for minus 95% by 2050. It also includes obligations to strengthen carbon sinks. The purpose of the Act is to promote transparency in climate policy, but also to enhance and coordinate the planning of mitigation and adaptation measures, to enhance the monitoring of implementation of climate measures, and to provide our Parliament and the general public with better opportunities to take part in climate policy planning and to influence it. Now, looking at the big picture and the trends in emissions. Overall, if we look at just the emissions, so from the effort sharing, the emission trading sector and domestic air transport, the emissions have been going down significantly. If you look at what's happening in the land use sector, this sector used to be a very significant net sink. In the recent years, it has turned into emission, and now the major challenge is to ensure that in going forward, the land use sector turns back into a sink to enable us to reach the climate neutrality by 2035. Now, looking at the sectors, energy sector is still the greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Finland. It's way larger than looking at the other sectors, including industrial processes and product use, agriculture, waste, and indirect CO2 emissions. The LULUCF sector, as I just previously stated, has used to be a very significant carbon sink, net sink, and now in the recent years it has turned into an emission, which is a big problem for us overall. If we then look at the inventory time series and the projections to 2040, and this is indeed a figure from our first BTR, and look at the trend since 2010, for example, the reduction in emissions has been significant. And looking at that trend and seeing with the current policies in place, that trend to continue, there should be no problem in reaching our emission reduction targets in 2025, 2030, 2035 and 2040. When we then look at from which sectors these reductions primarily come from, so it's really been driven by the energy sector and under the EU's emissions trading system, and that's the blue bars, where you see that there's been a significant reduction in emissions. Then looking at the non-ETS emissions, so the effort sharing, this covers agriculture, transport, buildings, heating, waste, and so on. So there also the trend has been going in the right direction, but the change hasn't been as dramatic as it has been on the ETS. The reductions in the ETS sector have been primarily driven by the changes in our energy mix. So here you see the energy consumption by fuel in the different groups, and you see this massive increase in the role of renewable energy. That is the blue lines, and at the same time the reduction in the use of fossil fuels and peat, and that's the red line. The black line, which has been very stable, is nuclear energy. That is a very important part of our energy mix. And then the lines at the bottom where you see the net imports of electricity are really small in Finland overall. The share of renewable energy has doubled since 1990, and it's now well over 40% as shown on this slide. Moving on, looking at the land use sector. So there again, the biggest part of the land use sector is obviously forest land, for us being a very forested country, then followed by harvested wood products, as you can see here on this slide, the settlements, wetlands, grassland and cropland. Now, the net carbon sink in the land use sector, as I previously stated, has significantly changed in the recent year, and this is due to the slowdown of growth of trees in the forests, as well as the high level of logging. I do want to stop here for a moment just to say a few words about what we are doing to align climate action across sectors in Finland. We have a whole of government approach and coordination structures in place across ministries. We are working very hard on sectoral alignment, so the measures in the energy sector is the primary measure, of course, has been the transition to renewables, wind, solar and bioenergy. There are also energy efficiency measures for buildings and industry. We've practically phased out coal for energy use, and also we're promoting clean heating solutions. In the transport sector, electrification is of course a big driver, but we also have incentives for low emission mobility and infrastructure. Some impacts is also from modal shifts in terms of promoting cycling, walking and rail. Agriculture, forestry and land use sector, obviously the common agricultural policy of the European Union plays a role here, but equally important are sustainable land use practices, carbon sequestration, the role of climate smart agriculture and sustainable forest management practices. On the legislative and regulatory instrument side, I already talked about the Climate Change Act. Also important for us is carbon pricing and emission trading, so the EU ETS, but also national measures that are market-based, including the taxing of fossil fuels. We have environmental impact assessments, and indeed climate considerations are embedded in planning and permitting. In addition, of course, monitoring and evaluation are very important. Finally, I do want to say a few words about Finland's climate finance. So Finland supports developing countries' climate action through development cooperation. The projects aim to mitigate climate change and to support human communities and natural systems in adapting to and preparing for the changes. Now, some of the main funding channels include, of course, we have FinFund and a lot of the bilateral channels, but also, for example, the African Development Fund, but also the Green Climate Fund. At the bottom of this page on the slide, you then see the trend in our climate finance going from 2017, when it was 119 million euros to 172 million euros in 2023. If we look at the balance on mitigation and adaptation, roughly 40% of our climate finance goes to adaptation and 60% to mitigation. That ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.